G'day, I'm Patrick. Welcome to the workshop. Today I'm going to be talking about what glue to use when. There are a lot of different wood glues. I use a variety in these videos, and so you might have seen some of them, but let me talk you through it step by step. And by the end of this, you will know what glue to use on certain projects. Let's go through the application of the 4 most common glues that I use. Titebond One, sauce bottle. More commonly found in this bottle, it is a non-waterproof PVA. Apply directly. You can smear it with your finger or a paddle pop stick. Wet rag handy. Clean it off. Clamp it together. They're really slippery. PVA in general is really slippery. Got an open time of, once it's clamped, I wouldn't want to unclamp it to fix it after about 5 minutes. That even might be generous. Titebond Three looks like this. It's a more waterproof PVA. Titebond Two kind of sits in the middle. I don't use it that often. Application's the same. You can still use your finger. However, for all PVAs, I love using these little rollers. It's like a sample roller from the hardware store. They cost next to nothing and you just put them straight into some water afterwards. As long as you dry it out before you use it, it lives in the water, and I've used the same one for years. These rollers are really useful for larger areas. They soak up a fair bit of glue, so you don't want to use them for every single small application like this. But even though it's a waterproof glue, it's just water cleanup at this stage. Okay, 20-minute polyurethane. Whether you're using a rapid or a slow polyurethane, the same thing applies here. Do not use your skin or your fingers to spread it. Spread it with a paddle pop stick or something else. It does not work well with a roller, it does not work well with a brush. Generally you need a spatula or a stick or something. If you touch it with your skin, it will blacken your skin. I generally do any application with polyurethane using gloves. Third application I'm going to show you is Techniglue. It's an epoxy, also requires gloves. It's a 2-to-1 mix. I will usually measure this out with a scale, but not everyone has a scale, so you can do it by eye. And I'll mix this on a flat pallet, a piece of scrap wood. Gloves on, it gets messy, it's sticky, kind of sticks to everything. You can use it as a filler or a glue or both. It smells like fishy mice. Truly unpleasant, but incredibly effective glue. Whew. That is not good. 2 parts of the white stuff and half that amount of the yellow stuff. Give that a really good mix. Use a different stick or spoon to get the stuff out of a tin, otherwise you're going to cross-contaminate and you'll ruin a tin. The aim for this little glue stack is to show you the colour of each glue after it's dried. So I'm going to clamp this together and I'll continue this tomorrow. Glue is dried, I can remove it, I can cut these faces clean and we can look at those glue lines. But before we do, just very briefly, some of the ways I remove glue, depending on what the glue is. This line here is the epoxy. It's very, very hard. This line here is a polyurethane. It's foamy and quite soft. And there's a little bit of squeeze out of PVA that you can't really see. You can see it a bit better on the end there. It's also quite hard, both the Type 1 and Type 3. Epoxy chips off. It's very hard on blades. It sands off quite well because it's very hard. Primarily, I'll use a combination of sanding and scraping. Polyurethane is softer. You can sand that as well. But I really love using a blunt, sort of like a vegetable knife. It's not super blunt, but I found that using a chisel or a very sharp knife, you can actually tear the timber fibers. Whereas if you use something that's a little blunter, you can pull that off really cleanly. Another method that I quite like is an offset chisel. This is just an Arax chisel. I've had it for ages. You can see that the blade is in a different plane to the handle, which means the blade sits flat on the timber. This is really useful for removing glue, PVA as well as polyurethane. you do need to be aware that if you're not careful, you can remove timber fibers. And so the best way to avoid massive tear out is by going across the grain to remove the glue. And you would do all this before sanding. We can use the same technique with this to remove the epoxy. Some of it will chip off, some of it will not, depending on how big the blob is that's bonded to the timber. So most of that chipped off really well, and that will just save you so much sanding time. Because the epoxy is often harder than the timber, you've got to be really careful when you're sanding it, because you can spend a lot of time on the epoxy and end up sanding the timber around it so it's lower, which is a really bad look. So I'm gonna dress this, I'm gonna plane it up and cut the ends off, and then we can look really closely at those glue lines and see, can we actually see the glue itself? I think this is a really important consideration on very light timber or very dark timber. With something like American oak, it might not matter so much, but we'll see if we can see it anyway. I've cut the ends off, I've dressed this block and sanded it. Some really interesting results, I think. On the face, no real visible difference between the glue lines. Titebond One, Titebond Three, polyurethane, Techniglue. It's very hard to see here, but the only line that I can visibly see is the Techniglue, is the epoxy. There's a line just there. You might be able to see it. It is more apparent on the end grain. That's the Techniglue. And you can see a dark line. Now that's not just the transition from one piece of timber to the next, that's an actual visible line. On the Titebond, on the PVA, I cannot see that line at all on 1 or 3. A little tiny bit more on polyurethane. So you're starting a project and you don't know what glue to use. I'm gonna run you through my decision tree, the process that I use to figure out what glue will be the best job for the project. Let's start with big flat panels, bench tops, tabletops, whatever it is. Gluing lots of sticks of timber together on their edge grain. Probably the most common glue up application that you will do and that I do. If your joins are tight and gap free, they've been put through the jointer and the thicknesser or planed by hand, you can almost always use a PVA, Titebond One or Titebond 3 or 2. If it's a kitchen bench top or a bathroom bench top that could be exposed to moisture, I will use Titebond 3 because it's more water resistant. A couple of small exceptions of some very specific timber types, which you are unlikely to use that often. The heat treated timbers. So these are often sold under the brand name Cambia. So there's Cambia oak, Cambia ash. They look brown instead of oaky and ashy. A Bodo is a similar heat-treated timber product, but it uses pine. The roasting process, which changes the color and changes the structure of the timber, means that they do not like PVA, but most of you won't be using those heat-treated timbers that often. One more exception, or just a side note, some of Australia's very oily timbers. This goes for spotted gum, black butt, and white mahogany, which is less common, but a very oily, dense timber. You can glue them with PVA, but you need to wipe down those glue surfaces with acetone beforehand, and it leaches some of that oil off those freshly cut surfaces, and they will glue effectively with PVA. If you are doing a bench top that is just huge, and you know it's just gonna take you a long time to put it together, you can either do it in stages. The open time of PVA is not very long. But often when I start steering into other glues other than PVA, it's because I need a longer open time. You can get long open time polyurethanes, and a glue like Techniglue and epoxy has a significantly longer open time than PVA. Now let's talk about joinery. So this is where a leg joins a rail. You've got a mortise and tenon, maybe you have 3 pieces coming together in a way that is complicated and tricky to clamp. These are the times that I think epoxy and polyurethane start to become more important. It is still very useful and common to use PVA, Titebond 1 or 3, when you're doing mortise and tenon joinery. The reason that I will sometimes not do that is because even though you might have a stated open time of 5 minutes or 10 minutes on PVA, if you have really tight joinery, like you've done a great job cutting some mortise and tenons and they go together really nicely and firmly, and you've got a good amount of surface area in there. What can happen really rapidly is you start putting that tenon into that mortise and the glue will grab. As soon as there's a bit of pressure on the joint, the glue will grab. And then you either have to force it, which you may damage the piece, or you get to a situation where you have to pull it out. And that can happen incredibly quickly. And it can be terrifying because you've spent a lot of time working on some nice piece of joinery. PVA gets very, very grabby, which is kind of crazy because on two flat surfaces, it's crazy slippery. It's really hard to glue two flat panels together and them not just slide all over the place. But when you have one thing going into another thing and it's really tight, that can grab before you've even got a chance to put clamps on it. Or if you've pushed it in halfway by hand and you go to grab clamps, or you've gone and tried to clamp the other bit together, that's when I start to be wary of using PVA. Now, if your joints, if you can easily move them in and out by hand, then chances are you'll be okay. But if you've got a long joint, like a long, what would you call this? A long tongue and groove style joint, or a long dovetail where there's a lot of surface area and you're trying to slide that in there, or you've got some sort of glue up where there are lots of pieces that all need to go together, I would consider using Techniglue. When you're doing complicated joinery like this, it's very important to get glue out of internal corners because it's very difficult to sand them. This whole surface here, I won't even worry about because I'm just going to sand that. But inside these internal corners, you really need to get the glue out. Now, if you've got a glue up that you can use PVA for, the best way that I've found to get that glue out as this thing is drying, if you can get in there, is either a damp toothbrush. So you've got a little tub of warm water, you've got your damp toothbrush, you scrub out that join and then clean it up with a wet rag. And then scrub it out and clean it up. And this is after the thing has been clamped, so all of the glue is already squeezed out. You can only do that with PVA because it's water-based. If you are using Techniglue and epoxy or a polyurethane for a glue up like this, which I personally would prefer to do, you have two options. Polyurethane can be cleaned up to some extent with methylated spirits. So you can do a similar thing with a rag dipped in some methylated spirits. It doesn't clean up as completely as PVA will, but you can get it cleaned up. One tip I have for both PVA and polyurethane is you can wrap a little ruler or a blade, wrap some fabric around that, and use that to scrape those internal corners. And you'll get a whole bunch of glue on there. Then just shimmy the fabric around so you've got fresh fabric and do it again. If I'm using epoxy for a glue up and I know I'm not going to be able to clean it up afterwards because you'll just smear it, I will often tape every join. So this applies for doing cabinet work, panel work, where I'm joining a hardwood case together and maybe a miter join and I know I've got an internal corner. I will run tape along both edges of that entire join. On a small piece like this, what it means is doing a dry fit where you've clamped it together without any glue and then applying tape over those areas where the timber touches. I've just put it on one side there. I've put it right up to that join. It is not over the join, it is just right up to it, and then I'll put another piece on this side too. So you can still see a very, very slight gap in between that tape, a fraction of a millimeter. It's important that you don't get yourself in a situation where you've actually clamped the tape into the join because you'll see a little blue line. I've done it before. It's very unpleasant. Make sure that tape is applied well. You need to do this process when the join is tight, otherwise the tape won't be in the right place. And now we can separate this join, apply glue, clamp it together, and all of the squeeze out will be on that tape. When we've unclamped, when it's all dry, we can use a chisel and a blade to chip that glue off the tape and remove the tape. It's not as simple as just peeling the tape. Techniglue is so hard that it forms a very, very solid ridge there. So when you peel the tape just tears, but the tape provides a barrier between the glue and the timber, which means you can scrape it off rather than having to sand it later. The third thing I want to talk about is casework. So this is, you're building some sort of cabinet, you need to join a vertical panel to a horizontal panel and maybe multiply that by, 50. You're building a bookshelf, you're building a TV unit, something where you're joining lots of flat panels together, usually with biscuits or dominoes, or it's going into a rebate. Now, this application can go either way. It might be that it's really complex and really heavy and you're doing it by yourself and you need a long open time, in which case I would tape every join, like I've told you, and I would use Techniglue epoxy. If you know that you can get it together relatively simply, you've got all the clamps laid out, you've done a good dry fit and you've had a practice run, you can use PVA as long as it goes together fairly simply. And the advantage of using PVA is you can use water cleanup, which means you don't need to tape every join. But you do need to very thoroughly clean up every internal corner where one panel meets another panel. You could also use the tape method with PVA and it potentially will save you time. However, I feel like a thorough water cleanup with PVA is probably quicker than taping. Taping works really well with epoxy or polyurethane and will save you a lot of time in that application if you need to use those. But in general, I'd stick with PVA and a water cleanup with panel work, as long as you've done a good dry fit and you know it's going to go together fairly simply. Now that we've talked about those main 3 areas of gluing, I'm going to run through a couple of interesting things to know about each glue that will help you as you're gluing up. First of all, gappy joinery. PVA has no gap filling properties. If there is any kind of gap between the timber, it will not offer any strength in that area. PVA needs a good flat area where timber is touching timber. If you need to fill some gaps, maybe your jointer is not quite long enough for the work, or for whatever reason, you just know there's going to be a little bit of gappiness, you can use an epoxy. It has strength in gaps. It's one of the only glues that really does. A polyurethane will fill gaps to a point because it expands and becomes slightly foamy, but it doesn't offer strength with that gap filling. So it offers the ability to fill a hole somewhat. It might look a bit foamy if the hole's too big, but for a very, very thin line, it will fill it, but it's not going to offer strength in that area. So if you need strength in gap filling, use an epoxy. That also applies to joinery. If you're doing some through tenons and you know the internals are just a bit loose, you can use an epoxy and it will fully fill that whole internal area and make it incredibly strong. So, this is not a piece of joinery, but just for example, this thing has some wobble. In theory, you could use epoxy on this join and it would be incredibly strong. The glue actually likes having a little bit of glue in there rather than being totally squeezed out. Another interesting thing about Techniglue epoxy is you can tint it. You can tint it using sawdust of the wood that you're using to like a medium brown or whatever you need it to be, which means if you're doing a glue up, which is also kind of a gap filling, you can do it that way. You can tint it using any number of colors, which is somewhat useful, but primarily I have found it useful to tint it with a very, very fine sawdust or occasionally some sort of stain. You can't really do that with PVA, you can't really do it with polyurethane. So if you need a glue to be a certain color for some reason, then you can use Techniglue. Polyurethane needs a bit of moisture to cure. So if you are doing a big panel glue up using polyurethane, if you want to speed it up, you can spritz the edges of the timber with a little water sprayer and then wipe any excess water off. You don't want there to be actual water on there. A moist surface will make polyurethane go off more quickly and it helps the strength of the bond. That is not true for any other glue. Polyurethane expands as it dries. It foams up, there's some sort of reaction in there, and it forms a foam, which you will see emerging from the glue surfaces. This is relevant in certain applications. If you've done a mortise and tenon that's incredibly tight, and that glue is expanding inside the mortise and tenon, it could push the tenon out if it acts like a piston. I often see that happening with PVA as well, but it's not because the PVA is expanding, it's just because you're pressurizing the PVA and then it wants to spring back out. So make sure that you've allowed an area for glue to escape or you're not using too much. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you learned something. There are lots of glues out there. They all do different things, but they're all very useful. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps us out. There are some links down below to the glues that I've used in this video, and if you watch any of our other videos, you'll see me using these glues over and over. I'll see you next week with some more something about wood stuff. Let me know if there's anything in particular that you'd like to see, and I'll make you a video just for you.